You're a property owner and you want to become a property investor. You go to the bank, you've got a lot of equity in your property. You say to the bank, I want to buy an investment property. The bank does this calculation, they call it serviceability, and the bank comes back to you and says, sorry sir, sorry ma'am, you can't service any more debt, so we are not going to allow you to buy another property. Now, chances are you've heard that before, and that is why you are watching this video. Serviceability is one of the most common issues that a property investor will face as they are growing their property portfolio. You see, most people think the hardest part about buying a property is actually saving the deposit. When you're buying your first property, that may be true, but after you buy that first property, that couldn't be further from the truth. Now, serviceability is just a fancy word for how much money the banks will lend you. Every single bank has a different way of calculating this, and every single bank will likely lend you a different amount of money. But what we need to understand as property investors is that it is a finite resource. Everyone only has a certain amount of serviceability, and we need to make sure that we understand how to use it, how to maximize it, and how to protect it so we can grow the most amount of wealth possible. My name's Jack Henderson. I've grown a $40 million property portfolio before the age of 30 years old, and I can assure you, I did not understand serviceability when I purchased my first property, and over the last 10 years, I've come to understand it very, very well, hence the reason for the size of my portfolio. So in this video, I want to run you through what serviceability is, how it works, how we can maximize it, how we can protect it, and some little tips and tricks in between. So let's not waste any more time. Let's get into the thick of it. What is serviceability? So serviceability is a fancy word for how much the banks will lend you, how much you can borrow. It's also known as borrowing capacity, but it's essentially an internal algorithm, an internal calculation that banks use, and they use a few different things to work that out. So essentially, they will work out what your income is. Obviously, income comes in many different shapes and sizes. For you, income may all look like one thing, but in a bank's eyes, income is not all one thing. You have your standard PAYG income where you are on a salary, you get paid the same amount of money for your 40-hour week every single week of the year. That is very consistent PAYG income. Then you have other income like overtime, for example, or allowances where you get paid a travel allowance, or you get paid a food allowance or a meal allowance, whatever it is. That is not looked at the same as standard income. Then you also have people who earn bonuses or they get paid commissions. Again, that is not looked at the same as standard income. Then you also have people who are not PAYG employees, and they might be a sole trader, or they might run their own proprietary limited company, or they might be getting investment income from dividends or something along those lines. Again, it is not looked at the same. So every bit of income is looked at differently through the lens of different lenders. So we need to understand what our income is, what our income is made up of, so whether it is standard income or a multitude of other things, and how the bank is actually going to look at it. That is one part of the equation. And then the other part of the equation are expenses. So you have how much money you earn and how much money you spend. Again, not all expenses are created equally. So we have our common everyday expenses, food, travel, accommodation, all that jazz. Then we also have discretionary expenses, which are how often we go out, how often we go on holidays, how often we spend money on shit we may not need. Some people have child support when they're separated from a partner. We also have expenses like loan repayments, for example. They could be credit cards, they could be personal loans, they could be mortgages. Again, they are looked at differently through the lens of different banks. Again, we need to understand what our expenses are. Now, the good news is if you work with the right banker or the right mortgage broker, I personally recommend mortgage brokers over bankers because mortgage brokers have the ability to go and select any lender versus just one lender, which obviously a banker just works for one bank. The good thing is you don't need to know this stuff and you don't need to work this out dollar for dollar and understand how all the banks work, because if you work with a good mortgage broker, they work this stuff out for you. But one of the biggest things I didn't understand when I was younger, I started investing when I was 18, is how much of an impact different things have on your serviceability. For example, when I bought my first property, I lived at home. I didn't have any car expenses because I was young. I didn't have any, big lifestyle expenses. I didn't have any property related expenses because I didn't own any property at the time. And essentially my living expenses were as low as they could possibly be in the bank size and, obviously in reality as well. Which meant based on that income, I had the highest serviceability I was probably ever going to have when it comes dollar for dollar, meaning $1 of income versus, what my expenses were, versus what my borrowing capacity was. But as I moved through from an 18-year-old when I bought my first property into my early to mid 20s, what happened was I obviously earned more money, but with that money come a lot more expenses. So even though I was earning more money, it didn't necessarily that meant I had a huge amount more of serviceability. It's understanding how much you earn, how much you spend, and what that actually means for your borrowing capacity. Now, there are some general rules of thumb when it comes to income, okay? This is not perfect, but it allows you to have a high level understanding of what your serviceability may be. There is a term in the lending world called DTI, debt to income, which essentially means how much debt a lender will lend you based on your income. For my calculations that we do personally and for our clients, we work out that roughly there is a debt to income ratio of 5 to 6 times income, which means for every $1 of income, we can get $5 to $6 in debt. So high level numbers, if you earn 100K, you can expect that the bank will lend you somewhere between $500 to $600,000. Now, $100,000 is obviously a relatively strong income. And you can see that in comparison to the debt it gets you, it doesn't really allow you to get that much. So you could obviously imagine if it was 200,000 of income, you could probably borrow 1 to 1.2 million. 300,000 of income, you could probably borrow 1.5 to 1.8 million. A really good rule of thumb and a high level overview is to go, well, what am I earning? That can include not just your earned income, but then also investment income, whether it be from shares or rental income from properties, for example. The bank will lend you roughly 5 to 6 times that amount. But there are other things that come into consideration, right? So when it comes to expenses, a really common one is credit cards. Most people have credit cards. Most people say they pay them down every single month. But again, if we have a $10,000 credit card limit, even though it may be zeroed out every single month, the bank doesn't look at it like that. The bank looks at it that if you maxed out your $10,000 credit card and didn't pay it back at the end of the month, how much would that cost as a monthly repayment? So for every, again, general rule of thumb, not exact, but a general rule of thumb I found, for every $1,000 of credit card limit you have. So you might have a $10,000 credit card in your wallet, you might have a $3,000 credit card in your wallet, whatever it is. $1,000 of credit card limit means $10,000 in a decrease of borrowing capacity. So in this example, where we had a $10,000 credit card, it would have a $100,000 impact on serviceability. So if we go back here to this scenario and we go, well, the debt to income ratio is 5 to 6 times income. So we have $100,000 of income, which gives us $500,000 to $600,000 in debt. Again, general rule of thumb, but we also have a $10,000 credit card. That means we're going to take $100,000 off this $500,000 to $600,000. So now we can probably only borrow $400,000 to $500,000. You could have other things in there. For example, you may have a car loan, almost finished paying that car off. Let's say you're in the last 12 months. But again, the bank doesn't look at it and says, well, you've only got 12 months to pay the car off. So we'll assume that that's going to be paid off in 12 months and we won't actually assess that. The bank just goes, how much is that repayment? $250 per month or, $3,000 a year or whatever it works out to be. They just assume that that's going to be an ongoing payment, which again, smashes your serviceability. We need to be really conscious of how much we earn, how much we spend, and what our expenses look like, because a regular reoccurring expense in the bank size is a bad thing. If you go on a holiday and spend $10,000 or $15,000, for example, $20,000, whatever the number is, that's a once-off expense. As long as that's not as a common thing, the banks won't look at that as having a massive impact on your serviceability. They just go, that's a common once-off expense. But if you're spending thousands of dollars a month on things regularly, banks will look at that as a living expense, and that will obviously have an impact on your overall net income. So just so I don't harp on too much about this, income, one of the most important things, expenses, one of the most important things. The higher the income, the lower your expenses, the more money you can borrow. Pretty straightforward. All income is not created equally. All expenses are not created equally. What is very important is you work with the right broker to understand your current scenario and which lender. There could be 50 different banks or lenders on a panel, right? You've obviously got your majors, which are your CBAs, your ANZ, your Westpac, your NAB, your Macquarie. And then you've got all of these other lenders out there. Bendigo Bank, Bankwest, a million and one others, right? So there are so many different banks and lenders, and there are so many different ways to calculate serviceability that working with a broker, from my point of view, is a no-brainer. And that's exactly what I've done. Ever since I bought my third property, I've worked with a mortgage broker since then. Nothing revolutionary about what I've just told you, right? You say, Jack, I come here to learn good stuff, not basic stuff. I need to set the context first. Now, most people are not going to be able to grow a $100,000 income to $200,000 income to a $400,000 income to an $800,000 income, so on and so forth, right? Like, most people are not in the position to be able to do that. Sure, some roles can. If you're in a sales-based role, you could. Sure, if you run your own company, again, you could potentially control your own income and keep growing it. But most people are going to probably have an income of $200,000 or less based on 2025 numbers, right? If we know that we're going to have a finite amount of serviceability and a finite amount of income once we get to a certain part in our career, what is very important is if we assume this is our serviceability here and this serviceability based on the bank size is $1 million, we want to protect this at all costs, because if we do not protect it and we use it all up, unfortunately, it is very, very hard to undo mistakes that we've made, right? And it's also very, very expensive. So we need to protect our borrowing capacity at all cost. And that is where certain strategies and certain structures can come into effect to make sure that we are doing everything we possibly can to maximize our wealth creation journey. Now, for example, if we went and used that $1 million worth of serviceability and we bought ourselves a little home on the prairie here and we bought ourselves a little investment and both of those properties were $1 million worth of debt, we'd essentially wipe that $1 million out. And like I said, unless we then dramatically increase our income or we dramatically decrease the debt on these properties, we're going to be stuck. We're not going to be able to do all that much. And we're probably going to feel like we're in a bit of a rut, because it does take a long time to pay down debt and it generally does take a long time to increase our income. Now, there are a few other things that have an impact on serviceability. Interest rates have an impact on serviceability. The higher the interest rate, obviously the higher your loan repayment, which means the higher your expense, the lower your borrowing capacity. Now, the lower the interest rate, as interest rates are coming down, the lower your loan repayments, which means the higher your serviceability. Okay, so what most people would have experienced if you've been in the market, we're paying a 2% interest rate. Amazing. Rates go up. They're then at 6%. We've tripled essentially what our actual repayments are on a property. That means our expenses have dramatically increased. That means our borrowing capacities have dramatically decreased. We can't control this, obviously. Interest rates go up and down without our control, which means we have to be conscious of that, right? So one of the big learnings for myself over the last 10 years is as rates are coming down, our borrowing capacities are going up. We want to make sure we use that, increase in borrowing capacity to the maximum ability. And as rates go up, we're going to have less borrowing capacity. So just understand that it might be a slower time for borrowing. But when rates go down, you want to make sure you capitalize on that, because they will not stay low forever. Another thing we also need to do is we need to plan for life. For example, this is two people. Hopefully, both these people are earning good incomes. Let's assume that one of them goes and has a child and has to look after the child, and one person works. All of a sudden, you've wiped out 50% of your income. Plus, now the same income that was servicing both of you guys to live your life has to service 3 people, right? Because you have a child, or 4 people. So again, expenses will increase, surplus cash flow will decrease. All of a sudden, what happens is your serviceability decreases, and kids are not a short-term expense. Like I said, they are, the banks look at long-term consistent expenses. So if you've got a child and you're supporting that child, the bank calls it a dependent. That means that expense is going to be with you and you're going to service less and less debt. Okay, so just being conscious of all the things that have an impact on serviceability, but in the most basic, fundamental way to understand it is just that the higher your expenses and the lower your surplus cash flow, the lower your serviceability is going to be. Now, if I just take back a few slides I said in this one, we want to protect it at all costs, right? So if we know that the higher our expenses, the lower our surplus cash flow, the lower the serviceability, you're probably thinking, Jack, how do you protect our serviceability? How do we do that? If, for example, we have these two beautiful people here again, they look more like people now, which is good. You have two people here, and let's assume that combined, they're earning 300 grand a year. 300 grand, they have no debt. That would give them roughly 1.8 million bucks worth of serviceability. Notice I said roughly. Every bank's going to be a little bit different. We want to protect that $1.8 million. If they went and spent $1.8 million, got $1.8 million worth of debt, unless this $300,000 dramatically increased, they can't go borrow any more money. So what we do is we still use the $300,000 worth of income. And we do this for all of our clients. I personally have done this for 10 years. What we want to do is you want to create this little protection barrier. What this protection barrier represents is it represents an entity that we control, but it is not us. Let's assume this is called a trust. This is not a trust fund. Do not get confused with a trust fund and a corporate trust. This is a trust. The way that this works is the income is still used for serviceability, but instead of the debt being tied to us personally, the debt is tied to the trust, which essentially means that we create this barrier around where the debt sits and it doesn't get tied to us as individuals, which means we can protect our borrowing capacity. Before we go any further, if you are someone like those two people earning the 300, they have $1.8 million worth of capacity, and I said they had no debt, right? So they still had that full capacity. If you are the two people and you have $1.8 million worth of capacity, and you've got $1.7 million worth of debt, which means you only have $100,000 worth of serviceability left, what I'm about to show you is not going to work because you've got all this debt tied to yourself personally. You can't hide that. You can't protect your serviceability. You have to unstructure your portfolio, which is essentially sell down some properties, remove this debt, reinstate this 1.8 million, and then do what I'm about to show you. So you can restructure. We have our entity here. This entity, just like we did, had 1.8 million worth of servicing because it's using our income as the income that it's deriving its serviceability for. Now let's assume that we then go buy some houses inside of our trust, and the houses have debt on them that equals $1.8 million. Guess where that $1.8 million of debt is now held? It is not held in our personal name. It is held inside of the trust, which means we still have as our individual capacity our $1.8 million if certain things are met. Now, I'm not going to get into all the intricacies because it'll make this video too complicated, but this is in its most basic form. If this entity can pay for its expenses over a period of time, means the rental income covers all the costs, the trust can be an entity that stands alone that doesn't affect your individual circumstances. And there are many, many ways to do this, but in short, what I'm getting at is if we know we have a finite amount of something when we are moving into investing in property, what we want to do is we want to protect that finite resource, because if we do not protect it and we go and use it and we go and waste it, even if we minimize our expenses as much as we possibly can and we maximize our income as much as we possibly can, we are eventually going to run out of serviceability. So just to fundamentally break down serviceability, Joel give me this great metaphor. That's a bucket, not a pot. Okay, let me put a little handle on it. That is a teacup now. Now, water comes into the teacup like this, bang, and it fills it up. That is essentially your income. As we get more and more expenses, we have these holes that come out of the bucket, right? Which means the water leaks out. The way that the bank looks at you is like, oh, that's your bucket. You got water in the bucket, which is your income. You got all these holes in it, which is your expenses. If we put one more hole in it, like this, will there be enough water to continue to fill the bucket as opposed to all of the holes draining? Okay, income, holes, water going out, expenses. Make sure you don't have too many holes in your bucket, otherwise you will run out of money, and that is not good. All right, so I'm going to do two scenarios now. The first scenario is you've got no debt and you're like those two people that I just ran through before. The number one you have to do is protect. Before you do anything else, you want to protect your finite resource. Structuring is a very big component of that. The second thing is you want to maximize your income. Now, maximizing your income doesn't necessarily mean going to earn more money. Maximizing your income is when you're buying a property, for example. Most banks have a way that they calculate the rental income that a property will generate, and they just use like a random 4% rental yield number. To maximize how much money you can borrow, if you got a property that actually generates 5.5% to 6% as a rental yield versus 4%, that means more income, that means more serviceability. Okay, so maximizing the income anywhere you can. And the third one, believe it or not, is minimizing expenses. Now, you can only minimize your expenses so much. You still need to live, but do not go out into the big wide world and get car loans and get credit cards and use Afterpay and all the, buy now, pay later services and have all of these facilities, because that will hammer your serviceability. You want to minimize all the unnecessary expenses. And if you're going to spend some money on some squirrely shit, maybe spend them, on a way that you can potentially hide it, like a little credit card that no one knows about or something like that. Now, the banks are really good now. They can see everything, or they have a much better idea of what's out there. But there are still ways you can have little accounts and little cards that if you're going to spend some naughty money, spend it there. And ideally, you can hide it. But the big thing is minimizing any unnecessary expenses. The less debt you have, the more wealth you can create. When I say less debt, I mean less bad debt. Okay, so this is the 3 things to do if you have no debt or minimal debt and you want to grow a big portfolio. Protect your borrowing capacity at all costs, which is ideally silo it, use structuring to your advantage, maximize your income. The income I'm mainly talking about is your rental income. The more rental income a property generates, the more debt you can service, and you want to minimize any unnecessary expenses. Now, if you're the other person who has already reached the limit, right? I used the example before, $1.8 million worth of serviceability or borrowing capacity, $1.7 million worth of debt, then unfortunately you can't protect your borrowing capacity anymore because you've already maxed it out. So like we speak to so many of these people, right? They get to 3 properties, they might have an owner rock and then they have investments, but they've got no serviceability left, right? Generally what will happen is they'll have like $600K of debt on the owner occupier, and then they might have $700,000 of debt on the 2 investments. And on those 2 investment properties, they might also have, let's just use another $700K of equity. So equity, for anyone who doesn't know, is the gap between what the value of the property is and how much debt you have. Okay, so in this scenario, they've got $700,000 worth of equity here. How much equity is in the owner-occupier doesn't actually matter. And they've also got $700,000 worth of debt. In a scenario like this, to be able to grow further, we actually have to take 1 or 2 steps back. What we do a lot of is restructuring, where we might sell down these 2 properties. We will then cash out that $700,000 worth of equity, minus expenses, obviously, like selling costs, etc. And then what we will do is we will use this to eliminate this $600,000 worth of debt, which means now we have no owner-occupier debt, which if you look here, we're getting back to a position where we can protect. So we have no owner-occupier debt, and because we sold the investments, we also have none of the investment debt. So now we get back to a square one position where we have a home. So let's say that that home's worth 1.5 million and it's got no debt, right? So we're back to the position of 0, okay? Maximum serviceability. So then again, we will use our protection mechanism, which is an entity. We will then start investing. Because we have no owner-occupied debt now, we've dramatically decreased our expenses, which will directly increase the serviceability. And then we will use the equity from this property to then use as deposits for stamp duty and costs and go buy assets inside of entities. So you've sold 2 properties off, you've gotten rid of any debt that was in your personal name, and then we go and start investing again. And you can build a portfolio 3, 4, 5 times as large by doing this, as opposed to just staying in your current scenario, which feels stuck, right? You've got a little bit of investment debt, you got a little bit of owner-occupied debt, but you can't make any more moves and you're tied up. So sometimes taking 1 or 2 steps back will allow you then to take 10 steps forward, okay? And you also eliminate the owner-occupied debt that you pay for with after-tax income, which is a huge win. So just going back a few steps, the restructuring process essentially follows this exact strategy. So if you are someone who's capped out, you need to go 2 steps back, and then you need to protect. Once you've gotten rid of the debt and obviously increased serviceability, you then need to go through and maximize income. So the future investments that you're buying, make sure you can get maximum rental income, and you want to minimize your expenses, which you've already done by eliminating your owner-occupied debt and any other expenses associated with that. Now, before we wrap, let me just give you a recap. Serviceability is a finite resource, okay? Use it sparingly, use it wisely. Imagine you only got 1 car given to you for your whole life, all right? At 18 years old, you got your first car, and that was you had to last forever. How much better will we look after that car? we would look after that car immensely because it needs to last us 60 or 70 years potentially. Borrowing capacity is the same thing. You are only given your borrowing capacity once, essentially, right? For most people. Use it sparingly and make sure that you use it to invest in the best quality assets that you can. Serviceability is just a fancy word for borrowing capacity. How much you as the borrower can borrow from the lender, and you want to make sure that you are not just going directly to the bank because they're only going to use their serviceability calculators or borrowing capacity calculators versus the other 50 or 60 or 70 people out there in the marketplace. Okay, so use a mortgage broker. That would be my recommendation. And the third one is keep your expenses low and your income high. Okay, that is the most important thing. In short, borrowing capacity, serviceability, whatever you want to call it, is the hidden roadblock for investors. Once you get your first property and you overcome that first roadblock, which is how the heck do I save my first deposit? Deposits no longer become the constraint. Borrowing capacity then becomes the constraint. So protect it at all costs. If you are already down the garden path and you didn't see this video before you went and maxed out your serviceability, don't be scared to take 2 steps back to take 10 steps forward, right? If you haven't gone down the garden path yet and you've seen this video before you've maxed out your borrowing capacity, use the method that I've personally used to build my own portfolio and the method that works for any big property investor in Australia, which is protect your borrowing capacity, maximize your income, and minimize your expenses, and you will grow your wealth 5 times larger than you ever would have been able to using the traditional methods.